Grüß, willkommen in einem video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 25 of my battle series of videos. This video series will cover the Polish campaign between 1st of September 1939 to 6th October 1939, with this specific video providing an overview of the development of the Polish armed forces. For native Polish speakers, my apologies if I incorrectly pronounce any Polish words. I'm sure that I probably will do so. While we're looking at the history of Poland, it's important to investigate the development of the Polish armed forces, especially the army. The Polish army was greatly influenced by two great events in the history of Poland. The first was the establishment of an independent Poland, and the second was the Russian-Polish War of 1919 to 1920. At various times, all three major nations bordering Poland attempted to utilise the Poles in the Great War by trying to form them into military units. The Russian attempt was the first and was mostly unsuccessful. The Austrians followed the Russian example, but unlike the Russians, succeeded. They formed several Polish military formations in their regular army, as well as forming a more independent Polish formations from the newly liberated Polish territories in 1916. Even the German Poles joined these formations, as unlike the Austrians, the Germans viewed independent Polish formations with suspicion. By 1917, the Germans' earlier suspicion was overruled, and they actively formed buffer minor nations between it and Russia, firmly under German control, but nonetheless with significant autonomy. By November 1918, the Poles went it alone and formed their first truly independent army. This army was heavily influenced by the Austrian army and to a lesser extent by the German army. Initially equipped with Austrian and German weapons, it was also organised in a similar manner, especially when Austrian regular formations made up of Galician Poles joined it. The second influence was the Polish-Russian War of 1919 and 1920. Although Poland was beginning to receive French weapons and equipment by 1919, it was still primarily equipped and organised in the manner of the Austrian army. The only exception was in the use of tanks, which the Poles began to use in rather innovative ways. By August 1920, the Polish army had dramatically changed. Massive mobilisation and an influx of French weapons and military advisors changed the army dramatically. It was now being modelled on the French army, although it did possess some unique Polish characteristics. Unlike the Western Front, the fighting in the East was considerably more mobile and fluid. The Polish army was based on troops which fought these fluid battles, and they learnt some valuable lessons from these conflicts. When the Polish army invaded the Ukraine in 1919, it was primarily a mobile force, supported by cavalry, armoured cars, aircraft and tanks. The battles fought in Russia were often decided by cavalry action, not by frontal assaults, but by cutting enemy communication and supply paths. The battles fought in Russia were largely infantry or cavalry battles, with little artillery or heavy equipment present. Forces which possessed mobility often did not possess the logistics to support artillery duels. In most cases, it was better to surround any well-equipped troops and simply starve them out. This situation had changed by August 1920. When Poland launched its counterblow, which shattered the Russian army, it did so by the use of artillery and tanks rather than by outflanking manoeuvres. It was only able to do this because it was lavishly supplied with French artillery and ammunition and was sitting on its logistic tail. These events created a Polish army which, although modelled on the French army, was a highly mobile and fluid army. The fighting between 1919 and 1920 provided Poland with a large body of very experienced troops, which became the officers and leaders of the Polish army of 1939. When looking at accounts of the German invasion of Poland, we have several accounts of well-motivated and led Polish troops, which caused the Germans grief at many cases or opportunities. In terms of quality, there was little to choose between the Germans and Polish armies. The result of the conflict, or the end of the conflict, was due to other factors than troop quality, motivation or morale. Now we need to look at the problems of the Polish army in 1939. The peak of Polish strength was probably between 1920 and 1930. Its army was large and highly well-trained. The problem was Poland could not afford to maintain this level of readiness. The Polish army of 1939 was not unlike the army of 1930. Most of the ambitious plans for re-equipping and modernising the Polish army were either scrapped or largely reduced during the Depression. So, in 1939, Poland found itself outclassed in terms of material quality. You could not win wars solely on the bravery and skill of your own troops. The troops needed high-quality tools in sufficient quantity as well. In 1936, members of the colonel's regime that has succeeded Pilsudski's dictatorship, alarmed at the rapid growth of the Wehrmacht, at last ordered a commission to examine the condition of the armed forces and the role they would have to play in any future conflict. The commission recommended the mechanisation of 4 cavalry brigades, a rapid expansion of the field artillery and the tank force, and primary effort to build up the number of anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns in use. Due to the limited defence budget, the modernisation program was to be phased in and was not due for completion until 1942. By 1939, one mechanised cavalry brigade was fully formed, the 10th, or Black Brigade, so called because of the black leather trench coats worn by the unit, and another one was being raised. A further 3 independent battalions of light tanks had been formed, and the Polish army had adopted the Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun, a very potent weapon against the relatively thin armoured German tanks. In addition, the Polish infantry had all been issued with a home-produced anti-tank rifle, which was to add further to their defensive capability against German armoured forces. So effective was the upgrading of the army's anti-tank capacity that, coupled with the excellent 75mm field gun, the Polish army had a similar anti-tank capability to the far better equipped German army, that is, division for division. This caused the Germans some embarrassing problems in their invasion of Poland, especially when they sent their tanks in unsupported. The anti-tank situation was similar, with the Polish anti-aircraft capacity also similar to the Germans, although the Germans in this case had far superior corps and army-level anti-aircraft capability under the command of the Luftwaffe. Nonetheless, this occurred too late to have any real effect on the course of the war, that is, the equipping of Polish anti-aircraft weapons. Only if Poland saw the real threat of Germany in 1936 and had gone all out to counter it, would have had any chance of matching German equipment and, most importantly, the numbers of those German equipment. The Poles had experience with armoured forces from a very early point in time. The initial Polish army consisted of some captured armoured cars, mainly German. In addition, they attained some French armoured cars and tanks, which they used to great effect in the invasion of the Ukraine. It was in 1920 that saw the greatest expansion in their armoured forces, with large shipments of Peugeot armoured cars and Renault M17 tanks arriving. However, the total number of these 2 types of vehicles never amounted to very much. During the Polish invasion of the Ukraine, the armoured cars were used as heavy support for the cavalry, often leading the deep penetration missions. The tanks were normally used in reserve, only brought up to crack a defensive position. It was in defence the Poles made the most use of their armoured strength. Here they used the tanks as strong points to deflect and hold back the lightly armed Russian cavalry. With no weapons capable of destroying these vehicles, the Russians were often blocked. By the time they found a way around these tanks, the Poles had withdrawn. When the Poles launched their great counterattack in August, we can assume that tanks played a part, although the campaign that followed did not resemble the earlier campaigns, which had consisted of rapid advances and mobile thrusts. The current campaign was very much a slow grind forward. The Russian army was still a powerful force, its defeat owing more to a lack of supplies than a lack of fighting power. The number of formations and vehicles the Polish army fielded at this time is unknown. When Poland invaded the Ukraine, we know the Poles had at least 3 tank companies, probably consisting of no more than 10 vehicles per company. Possibly a slightly greater number of armoured cars can also be assumed. By August, this force was greatly strengthened with equipment from the West, although the numbers were never great enough to influence the course of the war, particularly greatly after the 1920 counteroffensive. The development of the Polish army forces were heavily influenced by this war, and Poland put a great priority to the development of an indigenous manufacturing capability for these weapon types. They began by producing the WZ-29 in 1926, an armoured car. The Poles not only looked at armoured cars, and from an early date purchased some early British tanks, and from this design manufactured the TK range of tankettes in 1932. This was soon followed by the TKS in 1934 and the improved TK3 in 1935. Almost 700 of these vehicles were manufactured during this period, making Poland one of the major tank nations in the world at this time. In 1934, the Poles also developed the WZ-34 armoured car to replace the WZ-29 armoured car. The Poles also purchased some British Vickers medium 6-ton tanks, which they used to model their own medium tanks on. In 1934, they began production of the 7TP tank, an excellent light-medium tank similar to the Russian BT range. This was to be followed up by the 10PP, but due to money restrictions, this was delayed until late 1939, and thus no 10TP medium tanks ever saw action. Recognising the warning sign, the Poles began purchasing some French R-35 light tanks, which arrived before the invasion but were not organised into any operational formations. They all escaped into Romania. The Poles had the same problem with tanks that most other nations had. There were initially two schools of thought, the infantry and cavalry tank philosophies. The infantry school of thought taught that tanks should be distributed to the infantry. The cavalry school of thought taught that tanks and armoured cars would support and finally replace the horse in a cavalry formation. Therefore, each infantry division and cavalry brigade got a company of light tanks, and the cavalry got an additional company of armoured cars. There was a third school of thought, the massed tank school of thought, that saw the tank as the primary weapon, which could act like ships at sea and cruise around destroying the enemy. This school of thought began to gain influence in Poland, and it was this which prompted the development of the medium tank. When the first medium tank arrived, they were organised into independent tank battalions. In addition, the old French FT7 and Vickers 6-ton tanks and newer French R35s were organised likewise. These formations were to break through the enemy lines and roam around the rear, a flawed concept as these tanks were unsupported, and one pioneered by the British, but nonetheless an interesting advanced idea. Luckily for the Polish, it was finally decided to use some of these formations as the core of the next mechanised brigades, which was a very good combined arms operational brigade. Originally, the mechanised brigades were to use the 7TP medium tank, but these were not ready in time and the independent battalions were roped in. These formations had their own problems, but overall they were very well balanced and designed. The problem was that there were not enough of them. On the 23rd of March, the 1st Mechanised Brigade was formed, the 10th Mechanised Brigade. It was possibly originally called the Reserve Mechanised Brigade, as this name is used in some accounts of the Polish campaign. On the 1st of September, a 2nd Mechanised Brigade was formed, the Warsaw Mechanised Brigade. 2 independent tank battalions were available by the German invasion, and the 3rd, the 21st Independent Tank Battalion, was being formed when the Germans struck. The Polish Air Force started in embryonic form from the end of World War I, even before Poland gained its independence. In December 1918, Polish aviators who had served in the French, Austrian and Imperial Russian Air Forces swore allegiance to the Polish Republic. In September 1919, a Commander-in-Chief was appointed and a reorganisation undertaken which established the Air Force as a part of the Army, although not as an independent service. The development of the Polish Air Force was, like its armoured forces, influenced greatly by the Russian-Polish War. When Poland invaded the Ukraine in 1919, its small air force, equipped mainly with captured German aircraft, mainly Fokker D-7s and some British aircraft, performed excellent reconnaissance and rather effective ground support. As with the armoured forces, the Air Force was greatly expanded in 1920 with an influx of British Sopwiths and volunteer pilots from almost everywhere. Equipped with Sopwith Dolphins and Slado A1 aircraft, Bristol F-2B fighter bombers and de Havilland DH-9s and Bergert 14A2 B-2 bombers, the Polish Air Force's initial task was reconnaissance and attacking Russian troops moving up to the front. The highlight of the Polish Air Force was the discovery of a growing gap between the Russian Air Force, which was used so effectively to shatter the Russian army at the gates of Warsaw. The Poles never forgot this, and they expended a great deal of effort in the development of their Air Force. During the invasion in 1939, one of the highlights of the Polish defence was its Air Force. The Air Forces were more prepared for the invasion than the army. When the Germans invaded on the 1st, it had all its aircraft distributed and hidden in wartime airfields, safe from a German airstrike. Therefore, the Germans destroyed very little on the ground and quickly switched targets to the Polish army communications. The major problem with the Polish Air Force was its poor fighter force made up of obsolete PZL P7s and the average PZL P11Cs. While good by the standard of most fighters in the late 30s, it was no match for the Me-109, which was an excellent modern fighter. If Polish fighters found themselves against German bombers or Me-110s, they gave a good account of themselves. However, once the Me-109s arrived, the Polish fighters had little chance. Nonetheless, the Polish Air Force continued to fight until their bases were overrun, which was generally in the first 2 weeks of the war. A good idea of how effective the Polish Air Force was can be demonstrated by German air losses. The Germans lost 285 aircraft and a further 279 damaged beyond repair. In effect, about 25% of their total initial air power deployed against Poland was either destroyed or damaged. The Poles lost 284 aircraft in combat and a further 149 from other sources. While this video series is primarily about Poland, we do need to look at Germany in order to understand what Poland was facing or up against. In Germany, World War II was in many ways a continuation of the First World War. In many ways, the army reflected this. In the last year of World War I, the Germans discovered a new infantry tactic which effectively broke the deadlock of the trenches, infiltration. When the Germans launched their great offensives in 1918, it was led by the Strossgruppen. These troops were specifically trained to infiltrate defensive positions, bypass them and attack the enemy artillery in the rear. After 3 years of pointless trench warfare, the Germans discovered you did not need to take stronghold points. You simply bypassed them and waited until they surrendered or starved. Warfare had become more an exercise in logistics than simply charging at each other. Positions which were surrounded needed a constant supply of ammunition in order to defend themselves, which they did not get if they were surrounded. After a few days of normal defensive fire, it would find itself out of ammunition and thus it would surrender. While this was occurring, the infiltration troops would have got to the enemy artillery, which would find itself unable to defend against an infantry attack. While it's true the infiltrating troops would be cut off as much as the defensive position that they had bypassed, the difference was the infiltrating troops were mobile and the defensive positions were not. Mobility had been returned to the battlefield. As it turned out, the Germans did not have the resources to win the war in 1918, and the Allies counterattacked with new forces from the USA against an exhausted and starving Germany. One significant point was that the Western Allies never really learned this infiltration tactics. They won the war by simply outlasting the Germans, who were on the verge of total collapse in 1918. It is true the Allies did bring the tank into the battle for the first time, and that weapon was able to break through the trenches. However, this was simply more a function of brute force than any new offensive tactic. A tank could cover the dead zone safely, as most bullets could not penetrate its armour as it advanced. Initially, as this lumbering monster approached the Germans simply panicked and ran. Later the Germans would stay and fight, as they knew as long as they stayed in the trenches, the tank could not affect them too much. Some German forces began to man light artillery guns, which could destroy these devices at distance. However, it was generally but too late before the Germans learned how to counter this weapon too late. Germany was exhausted and had lost the will to fight, and tanks speeded up what was going to probably happen anyway. The Allies came away from these battles with the idea that the infantry tank could be used to burst through a line through any enemy line, if they were well supported by infantry. The Germans learned that the tank could burst through the line and get into the rear, like the Strauss troop, but were vulnerable. The Germans feared the tank, and when you fear something, you begin to really respect it. The result was, by the beginning of World War II, the Germans had partially mastered the tank and the correct way of using it, while the Allies were still unable to use it correctly, mired in the tactics of 1918. It is true in World War II the Germans did have many advantages against Poland. Most important was when they rebuilt their army, they rebuilt it from scratch. They did not have any of the older equipment which other nations had in 1939. When the Germans went to war, they may not have had the best and most of everything, but it was certainly the newest, or at least the most important part was the newest. Another advantage was surprisingly enough, the rise of Hitler. All armies are normally conservatives, unless some far-seeing leader remoulds and changes it. Hitler was not exactly a great leader, but he was not conservative, and he listened to lots of new ideas, which he insisted be implemented. These included airdrop troops and the Panzer forces. Hitler allowed the progressive armoured thinkers in the German army to create totally motorised infantry divisions and totally armoured divisions. No other nation had all their armoured forces organised into these types of armoured divisions. Everyone else had most of their tanks into much smaller formations. Smaller formations which could not operate by themselves and needed to work with slow infantry, thus they had issues which the Germans did not. Germany had another bonus on the road to war in 1939, Austria and later Czechoslovakia. Both these nations boosted the German army, and in the case of Czechoslovakia, boosted the German stock of weapons, especially tanks. Germany organised whole panzer divisions using Czech tanks, and Czech industry did sterling service in equipping the German army. And so we come to an end of my part 25 of my military history video, in this case the second video in a series of videos of the Polish campaign in 1939. In this video we have provided an overview of the development of the Polish armed forces. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.